I'm going to open up the chat
Mhm.
in case anyone wants to, make any comments or provide any feedback and things, and we'll go from there. So I understand we're going to hang out for about an hour. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, very cool. Okay, good. All right. So I've got a few things to talk about in relation to the DNS. It's my first time meeting everyone. I'm glad to meet everyone and glad to be here. I don't know everyone's sort of skills and knowledge around some of the stuff, right? So I'm just going to jump in. I made some assumptions, and if you have any questions or anything like that, put them in the chat. If I need to slow down in one part, speed up or whatever, let me know. Or maybe there's something that comes up in the presentation and you want to maybe get together again and explore it in more depth, and let me know. So I've got a sticky note here, remind me to make sure it was recorded, but I think you got that under wraps, Katie. Thank you for that. So so who am I? My name's Gareth. Um, I realize a lot of folks tell me I talk funny. I was born in England. I moved to America when I was a teenager. That was a long time ago. And anyway, moving to another country, as a 15, 16-year-old, it was kind of a brutal experience, and I had to kind of learn to say things differently. Anyway, the result is I realized I have kind of an odd accent that can be hard to place. But I'm not from South Africa. I'm not from Boston, you know, or anything like that. I live in Nashville right now, so we've got kind of the similar kinds of weather as you have. We're just maybe half a day behind you or so. It's supposed to be like -6 or something ridiculous like that tonight, so that'll be fun. So long as the internet and power stays up, everything's good. I'm a vintage nerd. I've been doing this for a while. 30 years. I'm pushing 30 years in the field. Um, I started my career as an electrical engineer, believe it or not. Back in the day, Motorola used to be a big deal. It used to be an American company too. Things were a lot different. But that's where I got my start anyway. When I worked there, um, someone stuck a couple of computers in my workspace, and there was no turning back. So, but since then, I've been in different technical roles. I've worked in the public sector, the private sector, for the government, private industry, and things like this. Um, my last real job, as I like to say, I was the information security officer for a government agency in Florida. I went out on my own in 2018. Here I am. I do cybersecurity consulting work, and I do a lot of training for um, all kinds of government agencies like the Federal Reserve Bank, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the U.S. Marshals, you name it, Capital One, Bank of America, things like that. So it's kind of fun because I'll be honest with you, I learn more in those engagements half the time than I think the participants do. And so it's kind of fun. Anyway, that's just to give you a little bit about me. So my hope in the next hour or so is that we get to review DNS functionality a little bit. Some of it might be a recap, some of it maybe not so much. I want to kind of frame this discussion as how DNS is used, right? So we'll talk about DNS functionality. We'll take a look at different DNS vulnerabilities, um, and then we'll take a look at how DNS both sort of supports and is the sort of thorn in the side sometimes of CyberOps. Touch on some privacy issues, which I think are kind of interesting, and then hopefully have a little bit of fun too, if that's okay. All right, so let's get started. Let's take a look at what DNS is and sort of the historical context around why it is that it exists today and why it still exists, which is just as interesting perhaps. So the problem is that when locating resources on a computer network, small or large, computers really like numbers, but we really don't, right? We names are how we think of things. And the analogy, which you've probably seen before, is if you think about someone that you wanted to call, although who uses a smartphone for phone calls anymore, right? But if you were using your phone and you wanted to make a call, rarely do you type in the numbers, right? Sometimes you do, but a lot of times you just pull up the contact, right? If I wanted to call someone, I look for the name, I type their name, things happen, and the phone rings, right? And it's the same sort of concept. So names make it much more useful. So how does this work? When we talk about name resolution, um, this is where we're using names to identify different network resources. They can be hosts, computer names. They can be website URLs, right? HTTP and what have you. They can also be different types of network services and things like this as well. So when a computer or an application, APIs, software, browsers, when they're trying to access one of these things, we can sort of refer or program it by name, and then it'll reach out to DNS, obtain the network address, which is in the form of an IPv4 and IPv6 address, and then it can use that in order to determine how to establish the connection, right? It could be a simple connection in the same network. It could be a much more complicated connection, meaning that it maybe spans across the internet or across the globe via the internet or what have you, right? So names are easy for us to remember. That's sort of the superficial answer for DNS. But realistically, computer names, the numbers, the addresses and things that they use need to change oftentimes, especially in the modern context. When we talk about cloud services, highly available services, um, clusters, and what have you, the services are going to move around a lot. And so using a static address is not helpful. Having a name that's managed by some sort of name service is much more, realistic and feasible in that kind of context, right? So anyway, before DNS in the olden days, um, computer networks would manage name resolution by using the text file, right? So DNS didn't come into the scene at the same time as computers did. Computers have been around for a while now, as you might know, right? So um, there was a text file that would be used and a copy of it would be provided on each of the systems in the network. When you think back in the day, if you had a computer network that contained hundreds of devices, that was a very large computer network, right? And so this little text file was a big part of system administration back in the day. And if you ever have a chance to talk to a wiry old graybeard Unix administrator, of which there's probably a few at University of Arkansas, if you're lucky, you can talk to them, and I will bet you a Mountain Dew that they have a story about trying to manage this text file and something going wrong and either it not being distributed properly or only part of it getting distributed properly. And then they'll tell you about this, wartime story about trying to get all of the services back up in the environment. So it was definitely prone to issues. Um, it was kind of an imprecise thing, like a simple mistake in typing the text. This text file could cause all kinds of network outages and what have you. And the problems only got worse as networks got large and networks continue to get large, right? Back then that was a problem. Things were getting big. Now they're even bigger, right? So this whole text file thing wasn't getting it done. And so, 1985, which that was a long time ago now, right? But that was when DNS first came on the scene, and it is established this central server. It contains DNS records, there's different record types. We'll explore those briefly, and is used in order to perform name resolution. So instead of having this text doc installed on all of these systems, we've got the central server. All of the records on the central server is a source of authority for the names. Systems query the server, and we get the name back, right? So the text file, though, although it replaced the text file, this whole text file thing is still in place. Well, really all operating systems, modern operating systems still have this thing. Anyone know what the name of the file is? By the way, you can use the chat. What's the name of the text file I'm referring to? Anyone seen this before? You might have explored this or seen this and you're tinkering or working in the lab or anything like that. It's okay if you don't, because we'll explore it together. But brownie points to anyone that can tell me the name of the file, and especially large brownie points, maybe like a brownie cake, if you can tell me the path in Windows and Linux where this text file lives. All right, close. Oh, you're really close, Stephen. I like that. That would be the configuration of the network interface. That's a good one. But feel free to Google or Gemini or ChatGPT. I don't mind at all. But we will explore it together. There we go. There's one for Linux, right? How about the Windows one? That's the tricky one. So, yeah, this hosts file thing, which Luke just identified, there's one in Windows 2. Path is a bit awkward. This still exists. It feels like an artifact from the past, but it's very much still in play, right? So, the DNS infrastructure would be a conversation, perhaps, a different day, different course, what have you. But it's a pretty sophisticated and far-reaching infrastructure. These DNS servers can communicate with each other and what have you. It's kind of interesting But the thing with DNS, like many early era protocols, is they assume a lot. A lot of early protocols, aside from being unencrypted, back in the day, you're just trying to get it to work, right? So the problem was, gee, managing this text file thing, this ain't working. We got to do something about this that's much more scalable and reliable. So let's create DNS. So how does DNS work? System needs a host name, sends a request to this thing it's been told to query called the DNS server. It gets a response, and guess what the computer does? It says, okay, and this proceeds, right? There's no checks or balances or any way to really validate that um, in thoroughly. There are a couple of mechanisms that are on the internet now, DNSSEC and things that you might have heard of. They help a lot, but it's still an imperfect system. But boy, does it work well. So modern DNS infrastructure still leverages and relies on this host file thing. I've got a little diagram here that we can take a look at here that tells a story. Hopefully I didn't skip a slide there. No. Okay, so let's take a look here. I got two scenarios, and in the first one, you see here this person. The question is, do you know the address for www.wikipedia.org? Right. So this would be like a website resolution thing. And so the first thing that's going to happen is the operating system is going to check the host file still to this day. Now, most of the time, you would expect really the host file has nothing in it, it's blank. So it's going to check the host files first. There's going to be nothing there that matches, and then it will query DNS. And in a forward lookup, you provide the name, you get the IP address back, right? In the second scenario, this is called a reverse lookup. And we see there that the computer, or the person using the computer perhaps, is trying to identify the host name associated with the IP, right? So you provide the IP. Again, it's going to check the host file, and then it's going to go to DNS. DNS will provide a response. Now, interestingly, the response, if you provide the IP, after that, so in the first scenario, you query the website, you get the IP. In the second scenario, query using the same IP, oftentimes the response won't match. IPs, especially internet IPs, are owned and managed by ISPs and cloud providers. And so while you might look up the IP for a website and get an address, if you then look up that address, oftentimes you'll see that it belongs to like AWS or AT&T or something like that. So it just makes checking and validating these things sometimes can be a little bit tricky. But anyway, that host file is still a thing. Now, in the DNS server, we've got different types of records. A records and AAA records. A records are IPv4 and AAA records are IPv6. These are records that include the details for a host name. So if I provide an IP, the A record would include the host name. We've got pointer records, which is what supports reverse lookups. The records called C names, which are aliases. So if there was like a nickname, easy way to think of that would be like, if I went to Chevrolet.com, I could go to Chevy.com maybe, and it would be able to resolve that for me. Chevy might be a C name, which is the alias for Chevrolet or something along those lines. You can do this for host names and things too. MX records are for mail servers. NS records identify the DNS servers that are authoritative for a domain, like the ones controlled by the organization that owns a domain. And then we've got the trusty text records. Those come up in a few different contexts, but they're very useful and versatile and sometimes kind of fun. But there's something called the sender policy framework, which is a way to sort of validate email senders and things. Um, Again, different subject for a different day, but something to know and maybe something to research on your own, SPF. So what are some of the issues that are inherent with DNS? There are a few. I'll touch on them here. One of them, as you can imagine, would be DNS hijacking. Sometimes, very related terms and names, DNS poisoning, redirection, farming. So this would be, as you can imagine, if I was able to get my hands inside the DNS server, I could perhaps change some of those records, right? The A records and things. And I could change the IP address associated with those. So if you were using the DNS server that I had hacked, and then you typed in www.bankofamerica.com or something like this, the DNS server would respond, but it would provide an IP address that I've changed. And though you might end up on a site that looks like the bank website you would expect, it's not. Your computer will just sort of just again, it gets the response of the DNS server, just assumes that it's safe and trustworthy, right? And this is a legitimate, hack type. Um, so sometimes this same sort of functionality is provided by hacking the host file, perhaps less so than in years past. But if you can put an entry in the host file on a computer, you can get folks to go to the wrong place. Now, in an era of HTTPS, this can be a little bit more tricky to pull off, but still a significant threat. So modification to the DNS server itself, there's also a cache that the server maintains in memory that can be attacked as well. You can attack the cache, and you can change the record stored in sort of memory cache as well. Um, Another issue with DNS is called an amplification attack. Messing with the DNS server or using DNS servers to flood or DOS a target. So the way this generally works is the attacker creates some new website, just register some website, and then you're going to pick the DNS server that you're trying to take out, and you're going to claim that that is the DNS server responsible for this domain that you've just created. There's nothing that really prevents you from picking any DNS server that you wanted. So I could pick like a DNS server at University of Arkansas, for example. And I could say that's the authoritative name server for my newly created domain name. Then what will happen is you need access, generally you need access to a sort of an army of systems, a botnet. They're usually under the control of an attacker. They're referred to as the command and control, or the C2. And these folks generally will sell access to their botnets on the dark web. Interestingly enough, you can kind of lease access, for 10, 15, $20 a month. You can gain access to this botnet. Anyway, you have the botnet submit a query for a domain that doesn't exist, or you submit a query to resolve like all of the names in the domain associated with the one you just registered. What'll happen is the DNS servers, because they've never seen this domain before, they all go to the DNS server that I've claimed is authoritative for my domain. So all of a sudden, like University of Arkansas's DNS servers are getting flooded by, say, 100, 200,000 systems making this one request, and it can take the DNS service down. Why would that be a big deal? If I took a DNS server down, like let's say, for example, I took down the DNS server, assuming there's only one, at University of Arkansas, what could you anticipate would potentially be an issue associated with that? Would anybody notice? Anyone have an opinion? If you took the DNS server down? Katie's nodding. Do you think it would have any impact? Like how would you tell, maybe? We'll explore it a little bit. Well, let's say you weren't able to resolve names. Like you went to, let's say you went to, I don't know if you guys use like Canvas or Google Workspace or what have you, if you do any sort of virtual classes. But yeah, I wouldn't be able to resolve the names for the services that I need to connect to. Therefore, my computer wouldn't know how to connect to them. Therefore, everything's down, right? Like nothing works. Everything's offline. It feels like everything's offline. So it can be a very, very impactful attack, right? Very impactful. And you see these in the news from time to time. Okay, another issue that's associated with DNS, in particular the protocol, is called DNS tunneling. And you can actually, there are tools that exist, especially software, that'll allow you to steal data. But it just looks like DNS queries. And so a lot of organizations, especially those that don't have sort of cyber capability, and there's many, don't pay a lot of attention to DNS. It's one of these things that's sort of a byproduct of running a network. Like there's DNS traffic, just like ping packets and things. A lot of folks just assume, well, I don't really care. It's just people looking up names. And you can actually use that DNS protocol, and you can pull files out of the network, right? Because for the same reason, folks realize, gee, we need DNS to work, because if DNS doesn't work, nothing works. And so a lot of times it can pass through the secure boundaries of the environment, right? The firewalls and things. And so you can use DNS in order to take files that are in the environment. It could be, user work files. It could be source code files for application developers. It could be database files, you name it. Any content in that environment, and it comes out of the environment looking like it's DNS traffic. It happens all the time, right? Because folks don't pay attention to it, at least until they've gone to class, maybe. So let's talk about analyzing DNS defensive operations now that we've sort of set the groundwork a little bit. So some of the things that you can do, and if you haven't seen the Center for Internet Security, I definitely urge you to spend some time digging around on the website. They're kind of a big deal. One of the things that they provide are called benchmarks. Now, you may have come across this idea of hardening before, and this means changing the default settings of an operating system or application in a way that it operates more securely, right? To get a sense of what that really means, if you go to CIS, you have to create an account there. It's free and everything. Once you created the account, you can access the benchmarks tool. You can also access something called the CIS controls, which I urge you to download and take a look at as well. But the benchmarks describe how to harden things according to best practice. And it's overwhelming the amount of changes you have to make. For example, if you take a look at like the Windows um, 11 hardening guide, it's something around 2,000 pages of configuration items. It's crazy, right? So anyway, if I'm operating something as important as a DNS server, and I know that's all it needs to do, there's some really great guidance there, and I would want to implement that. They offer some tools and things to help streamline that, although that stuff's not free, but it gives you an idea of what this means. So if I'm operating DNS, in order to prevent some of these issues that we touched on before, making sure the operating system has been hardened, and then the actual DNS server service as well, that has to be changed and hardened also. And so benchmarks can give me some of that guidance. I also need to monitor DNS. So I need to monitor the log data from the DNS server, all of the queries and things that the DNS server receives. I need to monitor the server's performance, how hard the CPU is working, how quickly the responses are coming back, right? That response time can give me a clue if maybe it's being overwhelmed with traffic. The amount of volume, when we talk about volume, I'm not so much concerned about the number of queries, but when you monitor the network infrastructure, you would want to see the percentage of traffic that's attributed to different protocol types. I wouldn't expect to see a large volume of DNS because they're very small requests, a little text requests between a client and the server. If all of a sudden I see like 200 gigabytes of DNS protocol traffic outbound, you monitor my network infrastructure, that's an indicator of compromise. That means, gee, someone is stealing data in my environment and they're making it look like DNS, right? So I'd have to monitor that very carefully. Just like we said before, farming the DNS server or hijacking the DNS server, I'd want to monitor the DNS records and be aware if any of those records changed, right? It could be legit, but maybe not too, right? So these are things we have to watch when we talk about security operations. The DNS servers are something we have to be really prickly and excited about because they're very frequent targets, the protocol and the server themselves. So how does this really work? SIEM, I don't know if you've come across a SIEM, Security Incident Event Management System. It's a special kind of log server, and it includes security intelligence that allows it to help monitor, right? So one of the things I need to do is copy the DNS server logs that contain all this activity data to the SIEM. The SIEM platform can help me recognize things that might be odd. It could identify queries to known malicious URLs. If there's a site that's hosting malware, that stuff's pretty well documented oftentimes. And so the SIEM may have a feed of information and it would see when that query has occurred and it could create an alert. Hey, Gareth's computer just accessed the site that we know hosts malware or something. It could also alert me if there's a spike in DNS query volume. That sometimes that can be weird if someone's performing recon scanning the network and things, some things like this. Sometimes that can result in them all of a sudden performing way more queries against a DNS server than I would expect. That would be suspicious too. Something called long tail analysis as well. This applies in a lot of different contexts, but there's going to be a bunch of host names and websites that people are going to query and access all the time, right? So what you do is you make this graph and it lists all of the hosts and sites that are sort of queried in the DNS server, and it will give you a sort of frequency of each one. And so there's going to be a whole bunch that, many systems access. And then the the graph is going to sort of, slope down, and then you're going to have this section at the end where there's like weird stuff that people don't generally query that much. You ever heard of the Pareto principle? 20% of the work results in 80% of the productivity and what have you, 20% of the effort. So that 20% is going to be 80% of the problem. So that weird stuff at the end that you see, there's a good chance that's going to be weird, malicious, odd stuff. And so focusing on that can help. So anyway, collecting the DNS server query log data and creating, dashboards and visualizations like this, the team can help me with that. And it will sometimes identify some of these issues. I can also see the percent of overall traffic in DNS. It can help me with that. And I can see just odd DNS queries, which might be indicative of DNS tunnel, like really large, strangely formatted DNS queries. Queries to text records a lot of times. Those text records can be used to send or receive commands and what have you. The other thing with DNS is it can support incident response. So if I become aware that there's some sort of malicious activity, or maybe weird phishing campaigns or something like this, and there's weird links that folks may have clicked in an email, or maybe an attachment or some sort of a payload that came in email. A lot of times when you open that up or launch it, it's going to reach out to the hackers' sites to download secondary infectors and things. And so I could go to DNS if I'm collecting the logs in this way, and I know this URL that appears to be the problem, and I think, gee, I think this might have hit a few people in the environment. I could go to the DNS server logs and I could look up and say, well, how many other people queried that domain as well? And then I can focus on those systems and potentially identify, some other, other more problems, right, to deal with. The other thing is that some of those other indicators, it can help me realize that that's happening. When we talk about performance, if all of a sudden my response times are really bad, the traffic volumes are really high, I get an alert and I realize, gee, the DNS server is currently, experiencing a denial of service attack. Those weird queries and things, right? If I'm getting alerts when the DNS server sees that, that allows me to perform incident response more quickly. So there's a way to detect problems, right? The key with incident response is being able to detect things really early and respond to them ASAP, right? The difference between an organization with a great cybersecurity program and one that doesn't have a cybersecurity program is not that they don't get attacked. It's that when when someone's trying to forge an attack, they're able to identify it quickly and resolve it before it turns into a big issue. A lot of organizations that don't have great cyber, just don't have cyber, their incident response occurs because all of their systems are down, right? Everybody's computer is infected with ransomware. No one can connect to any of the systems. No one can do any work. Gee, I think something bad has happened, right? So you're still doing incident response, but way down in the attack chain, as I like to say. Okay, so we've got some things we can do with DNS. This idea of a black hole. So we've got black hole, sinkhole, and filtering. So the way a DNS black hole works is where I leverage this capability of the DNS server, and I figure out a way to sort of configure it or give it the intelligence to recognize any queries to URLs in particular that I know they're bad, right? If there's a database out there, and there are many, that manages and tracks these malicious domains, well, if I program that into the DNS server, I can tell it. If anyone ever queries any of this stuff that's previously identified as bad, just don't resolve it. And so a black hole can respond with what's called NX domain, right? Non-existent domain. So the client is, let's say you get a phishing email, right? And there's a bad link in it. You click the link. What's the computer first going to do? It's going to try to resolve it with DNS, right? The DNS server is going to be like, oh, no, you don't want to go there. And it's going to respond to NX domain. My computer can no longer proceed because it can't resolve the name in order to figure out how to get there. Simple genius, right? So it's effective, and it could potentially be used to identify infected computers, but there's some more sophisticated ways. So the black hole just won't resolve the bad names, right? Okay, so there's something called a sinkhole. These concepts are all very similar, some subtle differences. So a sinkhole is like the the black hole, except that we're trying to leverage this in more of a sort of CyberOps kind of way. So it can block the request similarly to a black hole. It could just, and sometimes these terms are used interchangeably, by the way. It could just respond with the NX domain. But often the way we do this is we've got some sort of live threat intelligence feed that allows the DNS server to recognize malicious domains. And then when a query is given to a known bad domain, the DNS server will respond with information like the IP address maybe of an internal security system like a honeypot or something like this, or something that's just got a lot of monitoring it, and is able to capture more information about what that client computer is trying to do, right? So in a black hole, I try to connect to the malicious service. The DNS server is like, no, you don't want to go there. Okay, story over, right? I've prevented some issues, which is good. The sinkhole is going to say, oh yeah, that's like this computer whose IP is this thing. And then my system will try to connect to that in some way, and that additional traffic is going to be captured by that system, and it's going to do a few things. One, it can provide an alert, right? Instead of just saying you don't want to go there, it's like, hey everyone, Gareth's trying to go there, right? And so the incident responders can jump in. It can also collect additional information about what they're trying to connect to. There may be additional, um, uh, it might be trying to reach out and grab some additional stuff, or it makes a request to a particular service and things like this. Um, I can also present like a message to the user. So that, like if they were expecting a website, they may get a page instead that's like, hey, like that was bad. You should probably call help desk right now, right? Because as an incident responder, I'm gonna take all the help I can get, right? I can have all this monitoring infrastructure in place and everything, which is all well and good. But the reality is it's like drinking out of a fire hose. Once you turn on all of this cyber infrastructure to monitor and alert and watch and track and report and everything, I mean, it's overwhelming. So something as simple as someone calling the help desk and saying, like, my computer says like I did something bad and to call CyberOps, or like I clicked a bad link that's potentially malicious. That's wonderful. And the help desk is going to, they're going to have procedures, hopefully if I've trained them, and they're going to escalate that right away and say, hey, we've got a user in financial reporting that said that they clicked a malicious link that's known bad. I'm going to stop everything that I'm doing, right? So it'd be really helpful. Okay, so now another really common mechanism. I feel like it should be used more than it is. It's a wonderful mechanism, but it's just filtering. And so you can use this DNS server service if you use a more sophisticated DNS server service, you can extend this more. So the malicious stuff for sure. So the DNS query is going to go to the DNS server. DNS server is going to provide something different. It's not going to let you get to the bad service, but not just malicious services, right? It's going to, even if it's going to respond with NX domain potentially, if I want it to, just to not let you connect. But usually what will happen is you'll get a message in the workplace in particular that will say, well, you've connected to a malicious service potentially, right? So we're talking with a sinkhole. But if I'm filtering using DNS, what might have happened is the employee has tried to access a site that violates my acceptable use policy, right? In the workplace, I may say, okay, we don't want employees going to gambling sites. We don't want employees using social media sites at work. We don't want them going to webmail. We don't want them to go in any sort of adult content type sites at work, or sites that deal with weapons, or right. There's all kinds of categories of sites, and believe it or not, there are services out there that just kind of walk the internet and try to identify a site and the content that it's providing, and then they'll categorize it. So as the operator of one of these DNS services, yeah, you check the box for block malware. That's an easy choice, right? But then you can also go in there and say, well, block, academic cheating sites. No one ever go there though, right? Block, hate sites or adult sites or gambling, whatever. You just tick these little boxes, and then what happens is when an employee tries to go to the site, what they'll see in their browser page instead is, hey, this content has been blocked by policy. It's been identified as violating the acceptable use policy. If you believe this is an error, and they give you information about how to report it or whatever it is, right? Most of the time, employees are going to be like, oh man, I can't go there. They know full well, or what have you. And it depends from organization to organization. So these are pretty common. So I got some homework assignments for you, maybe. Not really. I don't know if has anyone seen these content. No, couldn't be. There we go. Sorry, I was reading that comment. I realized that was an old one. Has anyone seen these projects before, maybe? Piehole. Anyone come across Piehole, maybe? No? It's kind of a weird name, right? It sounds a bit naughty, but it's really not. So there's the site. It's pi-hole.net. It was originally designed to be used on a Raspberry Pi, which is kind of a fun way to use it. Um, you don't have to have a Raspberry Pi though. Just something that runs Linux will get the job done. A common, I don't know if common's the right word, but one way folks tend to use this is to spin up a cloud instance. I don't know if you see it on AWS, they have a service called Lightsail, and you can create a virtual machine on AWS, and it's got a fixed cost. The cheapest one's like $5 a month or something, which is kind of nice. It'll never be more than that. So you can kind of spin up a little Linux instance, and then you can run Pi-hole on that, and then you can configure that to be your DNS server. So you should take a look at that. I don't know, I can pull up the website maybe just so you see what it looks like, if it'll let me. This one's perhaps the um, one of the early services for this. So now Pi-hole was designed to block ads primarily. So when you configure this DNS server in your environment, well, part of the challenge is figuring out how to get all of the systems to use that as your DNS server, right? We don't have time to talk about that really so much, but once you do that, all of the systems in your network will not resolve any of the ad provider domains. So the net result is you don't have any ads in your browser. I could try this. Go to recipe sites are notorious for lots and lots of ads if you've ever gone there. So all recipes, for example, let's see if it's going to show me the actual site, has a lot of ads. So what you see here, like this big old blank section right here, this would be where a big ad banner would go, but it didn't load, right? Why didn't it load? My computer tried to resolve, when my browser tried to go there, tried to resolve that name, but I have an ad blocking DNS filtering service and it just said NX domain. It can't resolve the ad, so it doesn't load it, right? These big blank spots, more ads would go there. It's a bit of a cat and mouse game right now. There's a lot of folks, Google in particular, trying to fight this, but it's kind of fun. It's actually a lot of fun. And every device in your network, someone's on your Wi-Fi network, for example, will not receive ads. So that'd be your iPhone, your iPad, your desktop, your laptop, your whatever it is. Now the reason I bring this up is because it uses DNS filtering to do this. And so the configuration of the Pi-hole device, you can actually add in there the ability to block malware and things. There's some custom things data sets you can download and what have you. So give it a look see. That's a good one. Now another one that we've got this my personal favorite is called AdGuard Home, and so it's hosted on GitHub. Now there's an actual company behind this AdGuard. They actually have a paid service you can get. You might have seen it. You can set up AdGuard on your phones and things. You can plug it into your browser. They have a free tier and a paid tier, and it blocks ads. It does a really good job with it. They've got this adversarial relationship with Google right now. Google is fully aware of AdGuard. They do not like AdGuard. You can't download their app from the Google store because it violates their policies and what have you. But they've got some pretty sophisticated mechanisms behind how this works. And the AdGuard Home product works like Pi-hole in that you can install it on a Raspberry Pi or anything that runs Linux essentially. But it's got some really neat features in there where there's like little toggle boxes that you can use to block services. So you can like block YouTube if you wanted to, or you could block, certain websites. There's a dashboard that includes a few. And if I'd have thought ahead, I'd have had the page ready to go. Let me see if I can find it. I can show you what this looks like maybe. I have it running here in my little work network. It might take a little while for that to load. We'll circle back on it. But it's handy to block sites and in the workplace, but also at home. Sometimes there's sites, you don't necessarily want folks. I don't know. You might have parents maybe that spend a little bit too much time on YouTube and get all sort of amped up about politics, or maybe spending too much time going to like news websites that you really wish they didn't. You can kind of have fun with that. You can check the little box, and they can't get to they can't get to those websites anymore, and you just kind of shrug. Well, that's weird. It must be down right now. You can really you can have some fun. But in all seriousness, it does provide a lot of really cool functionality. And the setup and configuration and use of these services um, parallels the kinds of things you would see in an enterprise setting. Although it's free open source software, spending time, investing time in exploring those and setting those up and getting those to work is time well spent, because I think you'll find that time will pay dividends for you when you're in a more enterprise-like setting. Okay, so there are some privacy issues associated with DNS. I wanted to take the time to talk about this because all of these same things are used in different ways, right? From CyberOps, we use this DNS information to get insight into the environment, where we're monitoring what people are connecting to and everything, right? So as a defender, that's okay, but in other contexts, it can become very concerning very quickly. So the DNS protocol itself is clear text. It's an older protocol, legacy protocol. And so, um, we were just trying to get things to work back in the day. Now it's got to be all secure and stuff, right? So DNS is a clear text protocol. It uses UDP, it rides on top of UDP. And when you make a query to the DNS server, if you're able to capture the network traffic, you can straight up see exactly what was queried, right? And you think, well, that doesn't matter. I'm just trying to get to a website or whatever, right? Well, the thing is here's a packet capture tool, Wireshark. Maybe you've had a chance to explore Wireshark. It's a way to record network traffic, right? So in this view here, what we've got, I did just a simple network packet capture. I filtered the view to only show me DNS protocol, and then I kind of zoomed in there on those lines there on that first panel, and you can see the sites I connected to. You think I could tell a thing or two about you if I was able to look at your DNS query history? Maybe. I mean, take a look at these simple ones here. Right? ESPN, well, someone likes sports, maybe. Nick Jr., maybe they like cartoons, or maybe they have children, right? WebMD, what's WebMD? That's where you go. You got a rash, and then you come away from WebMD, you're like, I'm dying of cancer, right? Right? It can be a bit intense, but some sort of ailment, right? I mean, and so these are very basic site, high level sort of sites, but um, you get where I'm going with this, right? Just seeing the sites that you're connecting to, and you're thinking to yourself, there's some sites perhaps you connect to that you wouldn't want anyone to know about, right? So do you think if you put your browser in like privacy mode, or whatever, do you think that would protect the DNS server stuff? Katie's like, absolutely not, right? Feel free to use the chat, everyone. But yeah, no, not at all, right? Because regardless of what your software you're running on your computer, in order for it to connect to that thing, it has to query DNS. It has to query DNS to know how to connect to that service. So you can clear the cookies off your system where you want. That DNS query data, that is just a gold mine of information. So it turns out that yeah, this is actually like a huge source of revenue. So it is like a data mine. So whoever manages the infrastructure you're connected to, so in the workplace or a college setting or what have you, the DNS information that's collected is very useful. I can use it to keep the environment safe and secure. All right, that sounds good. But I can also use it to learn a little bit about what's popular, what people can connect to, um, and what have you, right? So internet service providers. You ever really think about that? You connect to, say, I don't know, you guys have AT&T or Comcast, or what do you guys have for internet down? Well, I say you're kind of down across over there in Arkansas. You have Verizon or Google Fiber or AT&T. What's the big ISP out there? Do you have one? Maybe you don't have one overarching one. AT&T? Yeah. We have AT&T is big here as well. So You hook up your AT&T service and then you surf the internet, right? What's used for DNS? Well, it's all going to be based on your ISP's connection. So the equipment you get from them is going to connect to their service, right? You have to pay the bill and everything. And part of that connection is going to include their DNS servers in order for your devices and your network to be able to connect to stuff on the internet, right? Your computer is going to send a query probably to the device. They usually set up to run a little DNS server in it. But the device has to then forward that request up to the ISP's DNS in order for it to work. So the internet service provider is getting all of the DNS queries from all of their customers by default. Unless you do something to stop that, they're getting that. And so it legally, they are totally allowed by law to collect, use, analyze, and sell the information contained in DNS. It's kind of messed up when you think about it, right? Because internet service, it ain't cheap, right? You're paying all this money and then they're data mining all your query data and selling and making a fortune in order to send you targeted ads and things. Now they're kind of tricky about this. I got a little thing in here from Verizon. Um, they kind of shroud this a little bit and make it seem like they're doing you a favor. So again, depends on the side of the table you're on. But when we said, for example, when I'm doing CyberOps, when you query DNS and you go somewhere that you probably shouldn't go to, I can provide a page that says, you know, you're violating acceptable use policy, you probably shouldn't go there. Some providers, Verizon is one of them, if you connect to a DNS, if you try to connect to a URL that doesn't exist, or maybe you sort of typo the site, they'll they'll get that and then they'll provide you with like ads for associated sites. And then when you click the link that is, oh, I typed Amazon wrong. You click like an affiliate link that they provide and they make money off of that or what have you. Or they try to push you to other services and things. Now they call it things like DNS assistance and things, right? So here's the deal with Verizon. You generally, these things are turned on by default and you have to opt out of them, right? So it says in there, if you try to change this, I got the message here and I highlighted it. If you prevents DNS assistance servers from displaying a page of links to sites that have similar domain names, note, if you change the DNS settings in the operating system, you could encounter problems, right? They kind of make it sound like that, we're really helping you here. And if you turn this off, it could be problematic, right? They really don't want you to turn it off. And it kind of hints at the value that this DNS data provides. So um, there are some new mechanisms that help protect DNS query data because it's more difficult than just changing the DNS server that you query because DNS queries are clear text, right? So if you're performing a DNS query and it's going across the ISP's network, well, they own that network, right? So you think they're recording the network traffic? You bet they are, right? For many, many reasons. So if you just change to a different a different DNS server and you're using plain old DNS, they can see it anyway still, right? And they'll still collect it and they'll still sell it. So there's some new mechanisms you might have seen that can actually encrypt the DNS query. And there's some drawbacks. There's some things that are good. There's some things that are problematic. So it's a hot topic, something to maybe pay attention to as you see it in the news and things like this. But the two protocols at play, and the one that's by far the most common is DOH. That's DNS over HTTPS. And its parallel is DOT, which is DNS over TLS, which seems very similar, but there's some distinct differences. DOH just looks like regular encrypted web traffic. It looks just like the same sort of thing you would see if you were looking at the traffic between like a browser and a website if it was encrypted, right? You can't really tell the difference. And so this upsets a lot of folks when they say, well, DNS is a protocol in and of itself, and when you put it inside of HTTPS, it's now no longer DNS, and so you're sort of breaking this unwritten rule around how protocols work. It's no longer DNS. It can be it's weird. The other thing is it's very hard to monitor for it now because the DNS traffic's hidden. It's no longer DNS traffic. It just looks like regular web traffic and it's encrypted. And how am I supposed to differentiate between the DNS query and the encrypted website? As the defender, this can be a real issue, right? DNS over TLS, try to address that and said, we can offer the same sort of functionality. However, we'll make it use a distinct port, right? There's ports associated with TCP and UDP. We don't have to get into that now, but it gives it sort of a fingerprint that allows it to be clearly recognized. And so I can create like a rule in a firewall that would simply allow or disallow it. I can't do the same thing with DOH. If I try to block HTTPS traffic, no one can access anything on the internet, right? So tricky, but it's preferred because of that exact reason. What's the issue? What we're saying is the ISPs can't access your DNS query traffic anymore. That's a good thing, right? Yeah, it's encrypted. As a network defender, I can't see it either. So all those things we said before about monitoring DNS and looking for queries and blocking requests to go to, you try to go to a bad site and like you don't want to go there. And I can't do that now because you're no longer using DNS and you kind of bypassing my DNS server. The way the DOH services work, they're usually baked into web browsers and it'll query stuff on the internet directly. It can be tricky to filter. So what this means is if I build up all of this DNS infrastructure to keep things safe and secure, you're not using it anymore. Your browser's bypassing it and just sending the traffic out like encrypted web traffic. That's not good. There is a way to defend against it, and it's to use the DNS filtering services, interestingly enough. In order for DOH to work initially, the first thing it has to do, it has to query and resolve the name of the DOH provider that's on the internet. So if my DNS filter is configured with the kind of intelligence it would need, rudimentary intelligence, to know the sites that provide DOH service, then if I block those, NX domain those, when the browser starts, it's going to query my DNS first to resolve the DOH provider's address, and then it can connect to it, and all of the DNS queries after that would be encrypted. If I don't resolve the name, it can't figure out how to connect to the DOH service, and then the browser will usually fail back and say, gee, DOH doesn't work here. I'm going to have to go ahead and just use regular DNS mode, which is what we want. So we've got to, it's cat and mouse here a little. Okay, so why do I care again? It's more than just monitoring my inability to monitor it. We said DNS traffic is a gold mine, right? So what I think we're really seeing here in a lot of ways is sort of a corporate fight over this DNS data, right? The browser companies recognize, I wish we could collect DNS data because we could really learn a lot. If only there was a way for us to tap into that in the same way ISPs can, right? So some of the folks that help develop these protocols are some of the browser companies. Now, by default, they don't use their own services right now, like the Google Chrome browser, super popular browser. I'm sure many of you use it. That had a lot of the new browsers, especially when you install them for the first time, they enable the DOH service by default. Now, right now, they use sort of neutral DOH services, but the way this usually plays out, they'll do that for long enough until people stop talking about it. And then with one browser update, all of a sudden the DOH provider becomes Google, right? And so now Google, not only do they have the information about your browser and things, but now they're collecting all your DNS query data, regardless of whether you're running in, privacy mode or regular mode or what have you. It also makes it hard for us to defend because it's hard for me to detect when this kind of, I can't read the DNS traffic anymore, right? So it's got some real significant, consequences. And so we have to kind of adapt our approach. But there is something called a trusted recursive resolver program. They're trying to standardize this and say, okay, if DOH, we see where it's good, but we can see where it can be, abused. And so there's, Mozilla sort of championed this. There's some other initiatives too. And they're saying, okay, if you're going to be a DOH provider, then we have to set some ground rules to identify that you're trustworthy and that you're not abusing the stuff that you could potentially collect and sell, or have you, right? Maybe something to look into. If you want to take a look at some of these providers to use yourself, Cloudflare provides a really good one. They've actually got, if you take some time on the site, they have a few different service levels. There's one that's just DOH. It won't filter or block anything. There's one that will filter malware, and there's one that will filter content. There's actually sort of an adult family filter service they have. I think that the IP is 1.1.1.3. And so I generally recommend folks that, have especially youngsters in their house to change the ISP DNS to the Cloudflare 1.1.3, and then it sort of helps keep things clean and so folks in the household can use the internet safely. Even parents and grandparents and things too. It can help them not accidentally land on something they didn't expect to go to. Quad 9 is another one. They filter malware. Google provides DOH. It's a great service and everything, but the Google factor is something to consider. There's another site called Clean Browsing, and they provide really good service as well. You can take a look at those websites and read a little bit about those services and what have you. Anyway, so listen, I hope this was useful. We talked about DNS. It's really interesting, and we could really any one of these things we touched on, we could definitely explore in much more detail. DNS really functions at the core of the internet. This whole query piece and to identify and connect the services is foundational to the way all of this stuff works. There's a lot of security issues associated with DNS. It's also something that we use a lot to solve some of the same problems, interestingly enough. And there's definitely a lot of privacy chatter around DNS data, which I urge you to sort of tap into and what have you. I've got a page here with a bunch of links. I'll share. I can probably drop them into the chat if it's not blocked. Here's a PDF version of the slides, if it will let me. Here we go. And on the back page there's just some links to some articles and some examples of some of the stuff. There's also got the links there to those two projects, Pi-hole and AdGuard, if you want to explore that some more. But oops, that's me. That's in the slides too. Feel free if you want to email if you have any follow-up questions or anything along those lines. More than happy to read your email. If you're on LinkedIn, I'm there too. You can find me, to search Cyber Gareth, what have you. But that's all I got. I hope that it was helpful and useful, maybe insightful. Maybe there's some things you learned today that you hadn't seen before, but that's all I got. So thanks for your time today. We're